The Ashen War forest didn't belong to anyone who walked on two legs during daylight. Everyone in the lowland settlements knew that. The wolves claimed it at dusk, and by dawn, whatever had happened between those trees stayed there, buried under pine needles in silence. Ardan Shaw knew the rules. She'd been coming here since she was 12. Because the herbs she needed only grew where no one else wanted to go. She had a basket over one arm, a small knife at her hip, and the particular kind of focus that comes from years of being invisible. You learn to move quietly when you're an Omega in a wolf settlement. You learn to take up less space, less air, less everything. She wasn't supposed to be this deep in the forest. No one was, not without pack escort. But the border markers were half-rotted and the escorts never came for Omegas anyway. So she'd stopped waiting for permission somewhere around her 16th year and never looked back. The sound stopped her before anything else did. Not a crack of a branch. Not an animal. Something smaller. Irregular. The kind of sound that didn't fit the rhythm of the forest. A scrape. A scatter of loose stone. A breath that came out too sharp for something that size. Ardan set her basket down without thinking. She moved toward it, pushing through a curtain of low branches. And then she saw him. A boy. Small. Maybe 6 years old. Standing at the lip of a drop she hadn't even known was there. The ground just ended. A jagged edge of rock and exposed root. And below it, maybe 40 feet down, the river churned white and cold against the stones. The boy had one hand stretched out in front of him, fingers spread, feeling for something that wasn't there. He couldn't see. She understood that immediately. Not just the darkness of the forest. His eyes were open and they weren't tracking. He was navigating entirely by touch and sound. And right now, his next step would take him off the edge. Ardan didn't call out. She knew better. A sudden sound could startle him forward. She crossed the ground between them in 4 long strides, dropped to her knees behind him, and wrapped both arms around his small body, pulling him back and down into her chest in one movement. They hit the ground together, her shoulder taking the impact, the boy gasping and twisting against her grip. He fought her. Of course he did. He didn't know what had grabbed him and he was terrified. All elbows and instinct, his boot catching her shin hard enough to bruise. Ardan held on. "Hey." Her voice came out lower than she intended, rough from the sprint. "Hey, you're safe. I've got you. Stop moving, please, just stop." He stilled. Not because he trusted her. Because her voice had something in it that children recognize before they understand. The specific steadiness of someone who means what they say. His breathing was ragged. Hers wasn't much better. For a moment neither of them moved. Both of them on the ground. The edge of the drop less than 2 feet away. Loose pebbles still skittering off into the silence below. Then the boy said, very quietly, "I couldn't find the path back." Ardan closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I know," she said. "It's okay. I found it." She got them both upright, keeping one hand on his shoulder, and steered him away from the edge without looking back at it. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that the way you notice weather, distantly, as information about the world rather than about yourself. The boy was thin under her hands, dressed well, but not warmly enough for how deep he'd wandered. Dark hair, pale skin, and those open eyes that looked at everything and saw nothing. He had a small scar along his jaw, faint and old, and he held himself with a particular straightness. The posture of a child who had learned early that the world was not arranged for him, and had decided to stand up anyway. "What's your name?" she asked, guiding him around a root. A pause, like he was deciding how much to give her. "Finn," he said finally. "Finn." She kept her voice even. "I'm Ardan. Do you know which direction you came from?" He turned his head slightly, nostrils flaring, scenting the air. It was such an automatic lupine thing that it caught her off guard. She'd forgotten for a moment what he was, what his father probably was. That way, Finn said, pointing with more confidence than she expected. She looked. He was right. Of course he was. He was a wolf, even at 6, even blind. His nose worked better than her eyes ever would. Good, she said, and meant it. We go that way then. They walked. Finn kept one hand loosely in hers, not clutching, just maintaining contact, using her as a landmark. He didn't speak much and neither did she. The forest settled around them, the light beginning to shift toward late afternoon gold. And Ardan let herself think for just a moment that this was going to be simple. She was going to walk him back to wherever his people were waiting, hand him over, and disappear. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Then she caught the scent on the wind. Wolves, multiple. Moving fast, coming from the north, and the dominant signature at the front of the group was something she had never encountered before. Not in the settlements, not at the border markets, not anywhere. It hit her like pressure against her sternum, like the air before a storm. Pure alpha, distilled to something that made the omega in her want to drop her eyes and her shoulders and make herself very, very small. Finn's hand tightened on hers. He'd caught it too. "That's my father," he said. And something in his voice was complicated in the way that 6-year-olds aren't supposed to sound complicated. Not afraid, not relieved. Just braced. Ardan had time for one breath before the trees ahead of them opened up, and Kador Drax stepped through. He was bigger than the trees made room for. That was the first thing Ardan noticed. Not his face, not the betas fanning out behind him, not the way the forest itself seemed to exhale when he stopped moving. Just that he took up space in a way that had nothing to do with size. The air rearranged itself around him. The light landed differently on his side of the clearing. Kador Drax was not what she'd expected from the stories. The settlements talked about the Alpha King the way people talk about weather. As something that happens to you, not something you negotiate with. She'd heard he was brutal, efficient, that he'd united 3 fractured wolf territories in 4 years through a combination of strategy and the kind of violence that doesn't require witnesses. She'd heard he never raised his voice because he never needed to. Looking at him now, she believed every word. He was dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed for travel rather than court. Leather and wool, nothing ceremonial about it. His face was the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had since become something harder and more interesting. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time. Eyes the color of winter water, pale and still, and taking in everything at once. Those eyes found Finn first. Something moved through his expression. Fast, almost invisible, there and gone. Then they found Ardan. And stayed. She felt it physically. Not attraction, not yet. Something more animal than that. Recognition, maybe. The particular attention of a predator who has just encountered something that doesn't fit the pattern. She was on her knees in the dirt. Finn's hand still in hers. Her shoulder aching where she'd hit the ground. Mud drying on her forearms and her cheek. She probably looked exactly like what she was. An omega who'd been scrambling through underbrush. She had no rank here, no escort, no reason to be standing inside Drax territory at all. She didn't drop her eyes. She wasn't sure why. It was stupid. Every instinct she'd spent years cultivating. The invisibility, the smallness, the careful management of space, told her to look at the ground and wait. But something about the way he was looking at her made her want to hold the line, even if just for a second. Even if it cost her. Kador Drax crossed the clearing in silence. He stopped in front of Finn, crouched down to his son's level, and put one hand on the side of the boy's face. Finn leaned into it slightly, automatic, and something in that small motion, the way Finn's shoulders dropped an inch, told Ardan more about both of them than an hour of conversation would have. "You walked too far," Kador said. His voice was exactly what she'd expected. Low, even, with a weight behind it that had nothing to do with volume. Finn's chin came up. "I was following the sound of the river. You said to learn the territory by sound. I said to practice near the eastern ridge, not the gorge. The path looked the same." "The paths are not the same, Finn. I know that now." A beat of silence. Then Kador exhaled through his nose and stood. He didn't apologize for the lesson that had nearly gotten his son killed, and Finn didn't ask him to. Ardan filed that away, the particular language of people who love each other without knowing how to say it cleanly. Then Kador turned back to her. She was still on her knees. She hadn't moved, hadn't wanted to draw attention to herself while they were talking. And now she felt the disadvantage of the position acutely. She started to rise and he extended one hand. Not quite an offer. More an acknowledgement that she was getting up, something to brace against if she needed it. She didn't take it. She got up on her own and immediately regretted the decision when her shoulder pulled and her expression flickered. His eyes tracked the flicker. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine." It came out faster than she intended. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has been lied to so often they've stopped being offended by it. One of the beaters behind him, a broad man with a red beard and the watchful eyes of someone paid to notice things, stepped forward. "My lord, she's an Omega from the Shaw settlement. No escort, no pack seal. She shouldn't be. I know what she is." Kador didn't look at the beta. He was still looking at her. "And I can see where she is." The beta went quiet. Ardan became aware, in the way you become aware of a change in temperature, that the clearing had gotten very still. The other betas had spread into a loose half-circle behind their king, and one of them, standing slightly apart from the rest, too relaxed for the situation, with the easy posture of a man who never worries about outcomes because he's already arranged them, was watching her with a smile that had no warmth in it at all. She didn't know his face, but she knew that smile. She'd seen it on men who sit at the back of a room and let other people make the decisions they've already made for them. He met her eyes, and his smile widened slightly, the way a door opens just enough to show you there's nothing behind it. Aldrich Drax. She didn't know it yet, but she would. Kador took a step toward her, and the air between them compressed in a way she felt in her back teeth. He was close enough now that she could smell the wolf on him. Pine and iron and something older underneath. Something that her body responded to before her mind could intervene. Her pulse ticked up. She kept her face still. He was scenting her. She realized it a moment after it started. The slight cant of his head, the almost imperceptible inhale. Not obvious, not performative. Just the automatic, involuntary thing that alphas do when something catches their attention and they can't explain why. Whatever he found, it stopped him. Not visibly. Not in a way the betas would have noticed. But she was close enough to see his jaw set, just slightly. The way it does when you've decided not to react to something, and the decision requires effort. "What's your name?" he said. Not a question. A collection. "Ardan Shaw." "Shaw?" He turned the name over like he was checking it for weight. "The settlement east of the mill." "Yes." "You have no business in this part of the forest, Ardan Shaw." "No," she agreed. "I don't." He waited. She didn't offer an explanation and she didn't apologize. She just looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has run out of the kind of fear that makes you small and has replaced it with something quieter and harder to move. Finn, who had been standing at his father's side in silence, reached out and found Ardan's hand again. Just his fingers, closing around two of hers, not asking for anything. Just marking something. Kador looked down at his son's hand, then back at her face. Something shifted. She couldn't name it and she didn't try. She just stood there in the mud in the late afternoon light while the Alpha King of 3 territories looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Behind him, Aldrich's smile hadn't moved. It was the smile of a man watching a game he already knows the ending to, waiting for the other players to catch up. The red-bearded beta cleared his throat. "My lord, the council is waiting. We need to return before dark." Kador didn't respond immediately. He was still looking at her. Then he said, "She comes with us." Ardan went very still. "My lord," the beta started. "She comes with us," Kador said again. And this time there was something final in it. The sound of a door closing. "She pulled my son off a ledge. She walks with mud on her face and blood on her sleeve, and she's standing here without shaking." He paused. "I want to know what she is." Ardan opened her mouth, closed it. There were 12 things she wanted to say, starting with the fact that she was not a what, and ending with the fact that she had not consented to any of this. But she was one Omega, standing inside Drax territory, surrounded by wolves who answered to the man in front of her, and Finn's hand was still in hers. And she was fairly certain that if she made this difficult things would happen in return. So she said nothing. And that, Bryn would tell you, was the moment. Not the rescue. Not the claiming that came later. This, the silence she chose, and what it cost her, and the way Kador Drax watched her choose it like he understood exactly what it meant. The Drax stronghold was not what she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined it at all, actually. You don't spend time picturing the inside of places you're never supposed to enter. But if she had, she might have expected something colder, more deliberately intimidating. The kind of architecture that exists to remind you of your place before you've even found a seat. Instead, it was just large. Stone walls that had absorbed decades of firelight and gone amber with it. High ceilings that swallowed sound. Floors worn smooth by generations of boots. It smelled like wood smoke and tallow, and the particular deep musk of a wolf pack in residence. Layered and complex, like a cord held for a very long time. The great hall was already occupied when they arrived. 7 men and 2 women arranged around a long table, all of them turning when Kador walked in. And all of them finding Ardan within the first 3 seconds. She felt the assessment like pressure on her skin. Her rank, her settlement, her clothes still damp with river mud, the absence of any pack seal at her throat. Everything about her said wrong place, wrong time, wrong person. She kept her chin level and her hands still. Finn had been taken gently but firmly by a woman near the door. Older, efficient, with the practiced hands of someone who has managed a child's needs for years. He'd gone without protest, but he'd turned his head toward Ardan as they led him away. And something about that small orientation, his face finding her by sound or scent, in a room full of strangers, tightened something in her chest that she chose not to examine. Kador took his place at the head of the table without ceremony. Ardan stood to the side, not quite in the room, and not quite out of it. While the council settled, and the business of arrival sorted itself out. A beta she didn't know handed her a cloth for her face, which she used without comment. Her shoulder had stiffened on the walk back, and she was holding that arm slightly closer to her body than usual, which she was fairly certain Kador had noticed, and fairly certain she couldn't do anything about. Aldrich Drax sat second from the left. In the hall's firelight, he looked more like his brother, and less like himself. The same dark hair, a similar architecture of the jaw. But where Kador's face had been stripped down to function, Aldrich's retained something polished and deliberately pleasant. He poured wine for the man beside him without being asked. He laughed at something quietly, leaning in, the picture of an easy second son with nothing to prove. His eyes, when they found her, were the same pale winter color as his brother's. The similarity stopped there. The council moved through items in a language that was half logistics and half hierarchy. Border reports, a trade dispute in the eastern settlements, a question about the spring hunt. Ardan stood and listened, and let herself become furniture, which was a skill she had honed over many years and which served her well now. You learn things, being furniture. People say the real thing when they've forgotten you're in the room. She learned that the council had 3 factions, and that they did not agree on much. She learned that Aldrich spoke rarely, and that when he did, people listened in a particular way. Not the way they listened to Kador, which was careful and a little afraid, but the way people listen to someone who has already done them a favor and might do them another. She learned that the red-bearded beta's name was Oswin, and that he was loyal to Kador in the uncomplicated way of a man who has fought beside someone, and decided that's enough reason. Then Kador said her name. Ardan Shaw. The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when the person at the head of it has decided to change the subject. She stepped forward. Not too far. Far enough. The council will want to know what to do with you, Kador said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at some middle distance that contained the shape of a decision. You were inside pack territory without authorization. That carries consequences regardless of circumstance. I understand, she said. Do you? Still not quite a question. I was collecting herbs. I didn't plan to go as far as I did. I heard your son and I... She stopped, restructured. I didn't think about the rest of it until after. Something moved around the table. Not sound, more like the collective adjustment of people recalibrating. One of the council women, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward. The Omega admits to trespassing. The law is clear on this. 3 days in holding, pack seal confiscated, settlement notified. She doesn't have a pack seal, Oswin said, not unkindly. A beat. Then her settlement is notified and she is returned to them as a matter of... No. Kador said it the way he said most things. Flat and final, a stone dropped into water. That's not what happens. The silver-haired woman stopped. The room went very still. Kador finally looked at Ardan. Directly, the way he'd looked at her in the clearing, with that quality of attention that felt less like being seen and more like being measured for something she hadn't agreed to yet. She saved my son's life, he said. That is not a debt I return with 3 days in holding. He paused. Pack law allows for a claim of honor. A life for a life. Service rendered becomes bond offered. Ardan heard the words. She understood them individually. It took her a moment to understand what they meant assembled together. And when she did, the breath went out of her in a way she hoped wasn't visible. A bond, not a reward. Not safe passage back to her settlement and a polite thank you and the comfortable erasure of everything that had happened today. A bond, which meant she would belong to this pack, to this hall, to the man at the head of this table, in the particular way that Omega bonds worked in wolf law. Not a mate bond. Not yet. Something more like a claim. A marker. This one is accounted for. This one is mine to answer for. It was, technically, an honor. She knew exactly what it was. Aldrich's wineglass turned slowly between his fingers. He was watching her with the expression of a man watching something he'd planned for, arriving slightly ahead of schedule. "My lord," the silver-haired woman said carefully. "A bond claim requires the Omega's consent under the revised—" "I know what it requires," Kador said. He looked at Ardan and waited. This was the moment then. She understood it with perfect clarity. The way you understand the geometry of a trap once you're already inside it. She could refuse. Pack law allowed for that. The revised codes, which the silver-haired woman had been about to cite, had made consent a formal requirement rather than a courtesy. She could say no, and they would have to let her walk out of this hall and back to her settlement, and her small life and her basket of herbs. And then she would be an Omega who had trespassed in Drax territory, who had no pack seal and no protection, who had put her hands on the Alpha King's son and walked through his stronghold and looked him in the eye without dropping her gaze. And the council would remember all of that, long after tonight's goodwill had faded. She could say no. She looked at Kador Drax, at the flat, still quality of his face, at the way he was waiting without pressure, without the lean of a man who expects a particular answer. Just waiting. The way you wait when you've already accepted that the outcome is outside your control, and you've decided to be at peace with that. She thought about Finn's hand in hers. The way he'd said, "I couldn't find the path back," with that particular, careful lack of self-pity. She thought about Aldrich's smile. "Yes," she said. Just that. One word, clean and without performance. And she held Kador's eyes when she said it. And he held hers. And for exactly 3 seconds there was nothing in the room except that. Then he looked away first. She noticed. She was fairly certain he knew she noticed. She filed it next to everything else she'd collected today and kept her face still. The council erupted, low and immediate. The sound of 7 people recalibrating at once. Oswin looked at his king with the expression of a man who has learned to trust decisions he doesn't fully understand. The silver-haired woman began speaking in careful procedural tones about documentation and settlement notification, and the formal requirements of a bond record. Aldrich set down his wineglass with a small, precise sound. He looked at Ardan across the table and smiled. Wider now. Something that reached closer to genuine. Which was somehow worse than when it hadn't. She didn't smile back. She stood in the amber firelight of a hall that was not hers, having just said yes to a life she hadn't planned. And she breathed through it slowly. The way you breathe through things when there's nothing left to do but continue. Kador Drax did not look at her again for the rest of the council session. But she was aware of him the entire time. The way you're aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly at it, but always knowing exactly where it is. They gave her a room on the 3rd floor. It was not a small room. That surprised her. She'd half expected a converted storage space, something that communicated her position here without anyone having to say it out loud. Instead, it was a proper room, with a window that faced east, and a bed with actual linen and a fireplace that someone had already lit before she arrived. The fire was low and steady, the kind that had been burning for a while, tended by someone who had known she was coming before she did. That detail bothered her more than the room's size. She stood in the middle of it for a moment after the woman who'd brought her up, young, quiet, careful not to meet her eyes, had closed the door and left. Just stood there, taking stock. Stone walls, wooden floor, a small table with a water basin and a cloth. Her basket, which someone had retrieved from the forest and left just inside the door, was the only thing in the room that belonged to her. She crossed to the window. The Stronghold's inner yard was visible below, torches burning at the corners. A beater doing rounds with the unhurried pace of someone who has walked the same path so many times it lives in his feet. Beyond the yard, the forest, dark now, The tree line a solid black wall against a sky that had gone the deep blue of late evening, not quite night. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and thought about her settlement. Her house, which was small, but hers. Her garden, which needed work. The particular quality of silence in a place that expects nothing from you, because it has decided you are nothing. She had not been happy there. She understood that now, standing in someone else's room in someone else's stronghold, which was a strange place to arrive at that particular understanding. A knock at the door. Small, low down. She turned. "Come in," she said. And the door opened, and it was Finn. He had changed out of his travel clothes into something simpler. A loose shirt too big for him, his feet bare on the cold floor, and he stood in the doorway with his head slightly tilted, orienting himself by sound. "You're by the window," he said. "Yes." "I could tell. The draft is different on this side of the hall when that window is open." "It's not open. The glass is cold. It changes the air." He said it without pride. Just information. The way he'd said everything else. He was a child who had learned to narrate his own perception, because no one else could do it for him. "Come in," she said again, softer. "You'll freeze in the doorway." He came in. Found the edge of the bed by touch and sat on it. His hands folded in his lap, his open eyes pointed somewhere near the fireplace. "Are you staying?" he asked. Ardan considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, and involved pack law and consent. That wasn't entirely consent. And a man who'd looked away first, and a brother with a smile like a closed door. None of that was for a 6-year-old at bedtime. "For now," she said. Finn nodded, like that was sufficient. Like "for now" was a thing he'd learned to work with. "My father doesn't bring people here," he said after a moment. "Not like this." Oswin said it was unusual. "Oswin talks to you about council business?" "Oswin talks to me about everything. He thinks I don't understand most of it." A small pause. "I understand most of it." Ardan almost smiled. "I believe you." Finn was quiet for a moment, his head tilting again, that small automatic adjustment. Then, "You weren't scared when my father looked at you." "Everyone is scared when he looks at them." She didn't answer immediately. "I was a little scared," she said, which was true. "You didn't act like it." "No." "Why?" She thought about it. The real answer was that she'd spent so many years managing fear quietly that it had become structural. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to not let it show, which was a different thing entirely, and one that cost more than people realized. "Because being scared doesn't help," she said finally. "It just uses up energy you need for other things." Finn considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away for later use. "My father is scared sometimes," he said. "He doesn't act like it either." Ardan looked at the boy on the edge of her bed, his bare feet not quite reaching the floor, his hands still folded in that too adult way, and felt something shift in her chest. Not pity. She was careful about pity. It had edges that cut the person you were feeling it for. Something more like recognition. The particular solidarity of people who have learned to carry things without putting them down. "He loves you," she said. It came out more certain than she expected. Finn's expression moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more complicated. "I know," he said. "He just doesn't know what to do with me." She had no answer for that, so she said nothing, which was sometimes the more honest response. Eventually the woman who'd brought Ardan up appeared in the doorway. She must have come looking for Finn, and collected him with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Finn went without protest, but he turned at the door, his face finding Ardan by instinct. "Good night, Ardan Shaw," he said. "Good night, Finn." The door closed. She stood in the middle of the room again, the fire lower now, the shadows longer. She unwound the cloth from her shoulder. Someone had wrapped it at some point during the council session, she'd barely noticed when, and assessed the damage with the detached practicality of someone used to mending their own injuries. Bruised, probably. Not torn. It would be stiff in the morning and she would manage. She sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots and set them neatly beside it. Because neatness was the thing you held on to when everything else had become uncertain. She lay down. Didn't sleep. The fire breathed. The stronghold settled around her. Its old stones shifting with the cold. The sounds of a large building at night. Distant footsteps. A door somewhere. The wind finding gaps in the mortar. She catalogued it all with the attention of someone in an unfamiliar place, learning its language. She was somewhere between waking and not when she heard it. Footsteps in the corridor. Unhurried. Heavy, not a servant's careful tread, not Finn's barefooted quiet. Something deliberate. The walk of a man who knows where he is going, and has decided to take his time getting there. They slowed outside her door. She was awake, completely, immediately. The way you wake when something changes in the air. Silence. Not the silence of someone passing. The silence of someone who has stopped. She lay still, her eyes open in the dark, her heart doing something she chose not to name. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was all deep shadow and orange edge. And the door was just a door, just wood and iron. And on the other side of it something was waiting. She didn't speak. He didn't knock. The silence stretched, 15 seconds, 30. Long enough that she began to wonder if she'd imagined it. If exhaustion had invented a presence out of the natural sounds of an old building. If she was lying here manufacturing meaning from nothing. Then she heard him breathe. Just once. A slow exhale, almost too quiet to catch. The sound of someone releasing something they'd been holding. And then the footsteps resumed, moving away, back down the corridor, unhurried still, fading until the stronghold swallowed them entirely, and she was alone again in the dark, with her heart still doing that thing she wouldn't name. He hadn't come in. But he hadn't left quickly either. She stared at the ceiling for a long time after. The embers cooled, the room went dark, and Ardan Shaw, who had spent years making herself invisible, lay in a bed that was not hers, in a hall that was not hers, and tried to remember what it felt like to take up exactly the right amount of space. She wasn't sure she'd ever known. But she thought, maybe someone had just stood outside her door and tried to figure out the same thing. He didn't come in, but he didn't leave either. And that's where I'll leave you tonight. In the dark. In the quiet. With a king who stopped walking and a woman who heard him breathe and neither of them willing to call it what it was. But I have to ask. Because you know I always do. Do you want to know what happens next? What Kador Drax does with a woman, he can't stop scenting and can't bring himself to approach. What Aldrich does now that she's inside the walls, close to his brother, trusted by his nephew. What Ardan does when she realizes that the most dangerous thing in the stronghold isn't the Alpha King. If you do, you know what to do. Subscribe. Because the next chapter of Ardan and Kador's story is coming. And I promise you, it starts exactly where this one ended. Right outside that door.